Hey everyone, I'm Robert Mann, and today I want to talk through the difference between a DA, a CC, and a CDC approval in a bit more detail. What are each of these acronyms? A DA is a development application, a CC is a construction certificate, and a CDC is a complying development certificate. The DA and the start of the CDC we could call a planning approval, and the CC or the completion of the CDC we could call a building approval. So another way of saying this is a DA plus a CC is effectively a CDC. It's just another way of getting it approved. What's another way of understanding this? A DA must be approved through local government, whereas a CDC could be approved through local government or through a state government representative, or we could say a private company, a certifier, who is using legislation produced by state government. In New South Wales, all of this is now done through the planning portal, which means whether it's a DA, a CDC, or a CC, it's all going through the planning portal, which effectively means the state government is able to monitor the process and be responsible for overseeing that this happens properly. One of the main reasons for this is that there's a time limit, or there's supposed to be a time limit on how long a DA or a CDC process should take. Now, I say should because it rarely meets that minimum requirement. What we find in most of the local councils, at least the ones that I've been dealing with in Sydney, is that they all seem to have more work than they're able to handle. This is the local governments. So most DAs are supposed to take 6 to 8 weeks to be approved. But what we often find is that they may take 3, 6, or 12 months to be approved. And this seems like it's mostly based on workload. What we find is that the DA application gets received. The next process that happens once the DA application has been received, it needs to be reviewed. Now, because this is done through the planning portal, there'll be a quick check to make sure that there's nothing missing. If there's things that are missing, the person that has uploaded the application might receive an email or a notice basically explaining that they need to provide more information. Once it has been received by council, then the next process that will happen, generally before a detailed review has taken place, is that the application will be sent out for notification or neighbour notification. The neighbours have an opportunity to object to the development application. So a development application is assessed by the LEP, the Local Environment Plan, and a DCP, a Development Control Plan. And these are planning instruments that are unique to each of the local councils. We find that the LEP is now quite similar, consistent throughout the whole state of New South Wales, and it's managed by the state government, which really helps that process to be more consistent. The DCPs, however, are very unique to each council, and we might find that each individual council might have a variety of DCPs depending on the particular area where your house is to be built. The DCPs may also change based on whether it's a new house or an alteration and addition. At the moment, we're just talking about houses. We're not talking about multi-res or commercial. And of course, we'll have different DCPs or different sections of DCPs that relate to this as well. Once that neighbour notification has been sent, the neighbours have the opportunity to object, and their objections are based on, does the design contravene any of the requirements of that LEP and DCP? Now, generally, the intention is in a way that would affect them negatively. So, is the design out of keeping with the neighbourhood context? That's an appropriate objection. Is the building too tall and it's going to block out sunlight? Is the building too tall and it's going to block the neighbour's views? Is the building too close to the boundary or just too bulky? Maybe it's based on the materiality, that it needs to match the same colour of bricks, or it needs to be built as a weatherboard cottage. Maybe the roof cladding needs to be tiled, terracotta tiled. The DA, therefore, is very much based on the neighborhood character and how appropriate the design is in that neighborhood. The DA process is not really about the construction or the constructability of that house. That really comes at the next stage, which is the CC. The CC is assessing the building, the design, the same design, of course, that's going to be approved in the DA, on its compliance with the National Construction Code, Australian standards, and will generally require some engineering input as well in order to show that the building is structurally adequate. Now, there may also be other engineering requirements. Some of those engineering requirements are already addressed during the DA, and some are more kept for the CC or expanded upon in the CC. The CDC tends to have less drawings or reports required than a DA process because the CDC is limiting the amount of different situations that can have the approval granted. If you're trying to design on a site that is zoned as environmental or for conservation or heritage or in a flood zone or has a very high BAL rating, bushfire attack level of BAL 40 or flame zone, which is the two highest, then this is going to prevent you from having that CDC approved and force you back into that DA approach. There's a few other aspects which might make you choose to go for a CDC versus a DA. What we find with the CDC is it really comes down to the interpretation of the guidelines. The certifier, again, the PCA, the Principal Certifying Authority, has to sign off on the validity of the design following the SEP, the State Environment Planning Policy, of which there are a few. And what this practically means for the design and approval process is that the CDC can be more strict and therefore may not allow for as much design creativity as a DA might, especially if it's a complicated site and the architect wants to do something creative to try to have a really good design solution, but that doesn't necessarily fit within the box of the standardized CDC or SEP approach. Generally speaking, the CDC is going to be faster. The approval process for the CDC is going to be faster. But the big thing to remember is the CDC isn't the equivalent of a DA. The CDC is the equivalent of a DA plus the CC, meaning that the CDC will get approved with the engineering in one go. Now, the problem with this might mean that you're committing to a lot of design drawings, you're committing to a design process as well as all of the approval documentation all in one go, maybe with uncertainty of whether the CDC can be approved. For this reason, I tend to prefer breaking the CDC up into two processes, just like a DA and CC, where we can consider it a CDC preliminary and a CDC final. Technically, these aren't two processes, but in order to make the process practical, most certifiers will offer, particularly private certifiers, will offer a preliminary design review and then a final CDC application fee, because they understand that this process can be complicated, and we want to make sure that the way that we're designing will be applicable and will be able to be approved without needing to go to the effort and expenditure of very detailed documentation, as well as all of the engineering that goes with the completion of CDC documentation. Once the CC or CDC is approved, that means it's technically ready to be built. That's all the information required for the Principal Certifying Authority to be able to sign off on the construction process. However, I'd advise that that's not all of the information that the builder should need. Very detailed construction documentation is required in order to ensure that the design integrity intended is carried all the way through the construction process. Everything that a builder does on site requires a design decision. So it's either a design decision that has been made ahead of time by the architect, landscape designer, interior designer, or the builder's making that decision. Now, a very competent builder might make for a substitute building designer or an architect, but that's technically not what the builder's there for. The architect can coordinate and manage the design process before construction starts, giving the builder a lot more assurance that what they're building is going to be exactly what the client wants, and avoid needing to make all of those decisions and ask all of those questions during the construction process, which would otherwise slow that down. That'll also mean that the design outcome is exactly as intended and as represented way before that construction process starts. So construction documentation is a really important inclusion even once that CC has been approved. Now, practically, that might mean that the construction documentation and the CC are produced together, or it might mean that construction documentation is being produced while the CC is being approved. That's a quick glimpse into that DA/CC CDC process in a little bit more detail. I'm going to be talking more about these topics in the future and providing more detail and practical experience explaining how to approach these processes well and make sure that they're as efficient as possible. Hope that's really helpful. I'll see you again soon.